To many transit enthusiasts in the United States, Japanese trains are exemplary modes of transportation. They are fast, clean, and the service has been refined over the decades to be as on time as possible. Indeed, when I went to Japan as a teenager, I was stunned. I felt as though I could really do anything, go anywhere. The connectivity was that good. I had no limitations. The history of how the Japanese government began to build out a network of this scale is underappreciated, if not unknown. In today's video, then, I want to discuss one of the precursor entities to the modern Japan Railway Group, the current 7-member private railway network that operates the Shinkansen and freight rail across the world's third largest economy. The Japanese railway industry at its inception in the 1870s was heavily tied to the inner workings of the Japanese imperial government. Although some private entities did exist, the majority of the capital invested in the industry came from those with either noble backgrounds or direct government ties. Indeed, the very first railway to be operated in the country in 1872 was an imperial-owned project from Yokohama to Tokyo, known in English simply as the Japanese Government Railway, operated by the Ministry of Engineering. In the 1880s, while private investment soared in certain regions, the government stepped in to cover for shortfalls on projects such as the Tokyo-Nagoya line, which, despite encouraging private investment, didn't receive the necessary funds. The imperial government didn't intend for the Japanese government railways to be a model enterprise or anything of the sort. Indeed, the government railway system would be utilized to bring the nation closer politically and economically, less as a commercial entity. The aforementioned Ministry of Engineering was established in 1870 to handle the operation of the JGR network and onshoring of Western inventions like the telephone, radio, and shipping. A quick side note, I will be using the terms JGR and Imperial Railway to distinguish the government-operated rail from private. During this time period, the two names were synonymous, but JGR seems to be the more common in translation. Additionally, the terms president and minister are used interchangeably to refer to the person at the helm of the state railway network. The passage of the Meiji Constitution in 1885 saw the Ministry of Engineering dissolved, and with it, the railways were placed under the Japanese cabinet and the portfolio of a Minister of State. That minister, from what I can gather, was Viscount Inoue Masaru, known today as the father of Japan's railway network. He began to lead the network's development in 1873. The management of the railways seems to have been kept in his portfolio, no matter the change between differing top-level ministries and departments, for the next few decades. It didn't matter who the Ministry of Communications was, for instance. From 1892 to 1893, operations were still overseen by Viscount Masaru. During the final year of his tenure working with the ministry, Japan's first domestically built steam locomotive, the JGR Class 860, went into service. During this period, you may consider the Imperial Government Railway to have been a kind of government barony, traded between the higher powers, but always kept in the portfolio of the most capable and trusted bureaucrat. In March of 1906, Emperor Meiji would sign the Railway Nationalization Act, which would establish a mechanism for the Japanese state to bring 17 private railways under control of the government through purchase in exchange for government bonds. The first batch of these companies to be purchased was the Hokkaido Colliery and Kobu Railway Companies in October, followed by the first private rail company in Japan, Nippon Rail, which was acquired in November of 1906. On and on this process went, with companies big and small being bought out either for the strategic importance to the military or for fulfilling a part of a national network. The Japanese Railway Ministry was granted authorization to take on these newly nationalized rail networks under then-President Hirai Seijiro. In total, 4,505 kilometers of track were to be managed by the state. Private rail would still operate throughout the country, primarily serving in a local capacity. Only a year after the completion of the nationalized rail network, the ministry was brought back in the fold of the cabinet for the next 12 years. Hirai Seijiro became second minister, with Goto Shinpei taking the role of presiding minister. Starting in 1920 and lasting until 1943, the Ministry of Railways was its own government entity. Public administration is a field unto itself. Japan is unique in that many state entities from this era were privatized, like the Telephone Bureau. The railway, though, was important enough to be spared privatization and upgraded from a small bureau to a dedicated ministry. I think the only proper analogy to make would be if the U.S. decided to make Amtrak a cabinet-level department unto itself rather than the state-owned enterprise that isn't situation they're in today. During this 25-year period of independence, the Railway Ministry did a bunch of great things, like cutting down on the use of coal trains by 25%, as well as adopting modern air brakes and expanding the areas served by just shy of 8,000 kilometers. The Yamanote Loop Line around Tokyo, for instance, was established in 1925 by the ministry, a line which now serves today as a key component to local service within the greater Tokyo area. It was also during this time that the ministry began to promote Japan as a tourist destination through the Japanese Tourism Board, primarily to English-language clientele. You may rightly ask yourself, well, why does this former ministry really matter? I would argue that the groundwork the ministry left from 1871 to 1949 made rail transit one of the primary modes of transport between and within cities. In the 1950s, when Japan was rebuilding after the war and began building suburbs, they built the rail lines first, homes and other facilities second. The rail lines in many cases were already there, and they were seen not just as something to have at the edge of town, but a focal point in the modern development pattern. Had the government not set rail as a public good the way they did, Japan Railways Group may have had no reason today to do all the fun maglev research they produce, much less build out the Shinkansen. Car ownership in Japan isn't a necessity like it is in the US. I talked about the way Tokyo was designed in a prior video. Effectively, members of the public are encouraged to walk or bike to get between destinations, while the metro is for longer distance commutes. When a metro station in your neighborhood is only 5 minutes away by bike or 15 minutes by walking, and you know it's going to be on time at regular intervals from 5 a.m. to midnight, the need for having private transport is minimized. The government saw that private interests were misaligned to national objectives, and so relegated those carriers local or regional service from 1906 until the 1980s. The privatization of Japan's railways could be a video into themselves. How they did it was especially unique insofar as what the government chose not to do. If you ever get a chance to live, work, or study in Japan, I encourage you very much to take a moment and remind yourself that the network you're using to get around, no matter where you are in the country, is basically 150 years in the making. 150 years of statecraft and engineering. If you like this type of content and want to see more of it, I encourage you to leave a comment down below, subscribe, and share this around. Thank you so much for getting to the end of this video. I hope you have a wonderful day.